welcome to Interface here on SABC2. My name is Tembi Samachele. Well, we talk BEE tonight. There have been some changes to the BEE codes of good practice aimed at placing more focus on black ownership and also criminalizing offences like fronting. But the changes have been heavily criticized as being too stringent. Others have hailed them, saying this is the only way for black South Africans to be truly empowered. Now, tonight on Interface, we'll try and delve into some of these issues with our guests. Let me introduce them to you. Nomzamo Xaba is the Group Executive for Research and Advisory Services at EmpoweredX. And we're also joined by Alana Bond, who is the MD and Head of BEE at Simanye. And as always, if you would like to take part in this discussion, you can do so via our social media pages. You can post your questions or comments on our Facebook page at Interface on SABC, or hit us up on Twitter on our handle, which is at Interface on SABC, or my personal one at Tembi Samachele. Ladies, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tembi.
So let me put a statement to you, Nomzamo. BEE has failed the majority of South Africans. Is that statement a true reflection of reality, or is it a little bit too harsh and, not fair, given that it's only been just over 20 years?
So I think it has been 20 years of democracy, more than 20 years, but it's only been 10 years of the effective measurement of BEE. So to say that it has failed outright is a bit of a harsh statement, I would think. I think we're making progress. It's slow progress, and you can see it through the things that are happening socially in the socio-economic space in the country.
Do you share that sentiment, Alana?
To some extent. I do believe that some progress has been made, but if you consider the amount of money that is available for BEE and the amount of money that's being spent on BEE, I think that the impact leaves quite a lot to be desired.
So is it still the right solution for South Africa, having seen everything that you've seen in your space over the past 10 years, effectively?
Difficult question to answer. It's a tool that can be used to address some of the challenges that we face in South Africa. There's no doubt that we need tools to address that. There's no doubt, in my view, that corporates left on their own, the economy left on its own, without some kind of government intervention, is going to not have the results that we expect. But I don't believe that BEE in its current form is doing the job well enough. And I think that the reason for that is because the corporate response to that policy is one of compliance at best. It's one of avoidance and evasion, as one gets progressively worse.
But shouldn't we then deal with the corporates instead of saying the policy itself is not delivering?
Well, you see, I think we're in a position where the corporates are blaming government and government are blaming corporates, and as a result, very little happens in the middle. The policy itself, I think, has issues and challenges. I think that if those were addressed, there would be a greater impact on society. But nevertheless, it is absolutely true that corporates have a choice in their response. And their choices are, if I'm going to comply, if I'm going to spend money, let me do so in a way that actually does create impact. And we're not seeing that.
Nomzamo, is it time to perhaps stand back from BEE and say, look, back when we introduced this is the solution that we needed for the country. It was a stopgap measure, and maybe now, 10 years of measurement and 20 years down the line, it's maybe time for something else?
But what would be something else, though, Tembisa?
I would leave that to people like you to find that out.
Yeah, I think we've still got a long way to go, and if you stop measurement at this point, we would actually be regressing at a much faster pace than what we are right now. In my view, I think that BEE it works in a similar way as your taxes. People find gaps for it, and the gaps should be stopped and not overhauled altogether. So to say that we could stop everything right now and find something else would be a bit of a dangerous thing to do, because what would that something else be at this point in our democracy?
Do you think government has been too nice on the corporates, just trying to beg them too much to comply and to do the right thing?
I think there's a part of saying that corporates do want to comply, and there are corporates who want to do more than comply. So to leave it at just a point of compliance alone is not something that should be left. And in fact, if we say that, has government done enough? Have they begged them? Is the stick hard enough? Are we hitting hard enough? I think that still is going to be seen at the next 2 years, in my view, between now and 2018 at least. We're going to see quite a lot in terms of how far people will go, because the new codes leave a lot of interpretation gaps, the lack of a clarification and the confusing clarifications that go out leave a lot of gaps where we're going to see whether corporates are going to go more towards the do as little as possible and comply where you can, and those who will simply say, well, I'm not going to do anything.
I want us to look at what exactly the new codes say. But before that, Alana, is this perhaps a time where we need to introduce more of a carrot or more of a stick?
I think that's a great question, and I actually wanted to comment on the comment about a stick. And I think that this is in fact the challenge. The previous codes did address some issues. There was some change. Of course, change hasn't been quick enough, and government, I think, has decided, well, we need to beat corporates over the head with a stick harder than ever before. And I don't think that's inclusive, and I don't think that it really drives the right behavior. If you look at studies around the world, studies actually show that people respond to incentives. So I think that a clever use of incentives, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Most of the elements that BE measures are good and need to be there. So I agree, we shouldn't just get rid of the legislation and start from scratch. But I think that we should be looking at how do we create the right incentives for corporates to do the right thing.
But like what kind of incentives? Because already government is saying if you get level this to that, you'll get more business from government. Isn't that an incentive enough?
The incentive is to comply. And I believe that that is the challenge with BEE. Compliance in BEE terms measures outputs. It measures how much money did I spend, how many people did I employ, how many people did I train, how many businesses did I support. That is output-based. If we want to create real change in South Africa, we need to go steps further than that, and we need to start looking at outcomes and impact. And spending money doesn't necessarily achieve anything. You can train hundreds of people on how to be an electrician, but if there's no electrical jobs for them to go into, we achieve nothing.
Do you agree?
I agree. Some of the challenges that we're seeing with BE is around the types of programs that people are being put on. Because if you're going to send someone on a health and safety training, they're not going to become a super health and safety training technician at some point. So I think the incentives do need to be looked at quite carefully, because if we don't look at those, then we're going to see despondency in corporates.
What kind of incentives would you introduce or advise government to introduce?
So if we look at things like, I might get hit over the head for this, some sort of tax break. I wouldn't know how that would be structured. They'd have to look at it quite carefully, but incentives that give more business to small businesses as well. So the whole enterprise and supply development initiative to say give more business to smaller black businesses, what are you going to get in return as a corporate?
So is BEE working? Is it working for you, maybe in your business? Do you think that government has been too stringent in the way that it's rolled out BEE, or do you think it has let you down as a South African? We want to hear from you. Do hit us up on our Facebook page and also on Twitter. We're back after this. Interface tonight, we're talking about BEE, and we're asking you if you think that BEE is the right solution for our country to grow our economy, and if you think it has been working for us so far. To give us your thoughts on our social media pages. Our guest tonight to debate this for us, Alana Bond, is the Managing Director at Simanye, and also Nomzamo Xaba, who is the Group Executive for Research and Advisory Services at Empowerdex. So high level, the changes to the codes, Nomzamo, what would you say the major ones have been?
So the major ones would be around skills development. So if you look at skills development, we are looking at doubling of the targets for training. But the good news there is that your training spend doesn't necessarily have to be only for your own employees. In addition to that is the introduction of the empowering suppliers from an enterprise and supplier development perspective. That becomes the new ticket to BEE or to performing in this country. In addition to that is the supplier development. So that's a whole new criteria which to an extent is new, to another extent it isn't, because depending on how you were doing your enterprise development before, you could have been doing supply development all along. And then also then the introduction of the priority measures and the threshold for ownership, skills and enterprise and supply development.
So, Alana, that all sounds really good. What objections do you have to the changes to the codes?
Well, I think that it's, once again, in how these things are implemented and the incentives that the codes actually drive. If you take skills development, for example, it's fantastic that you can now train people outside of your organization. And often this is done through learnerships. But what we find is that because companies are targeting points on a scorecard, and they're also targeting this in the most cost-effective way that they possibly can, they're very happy to pull people out of the townships, put them onto these one-year learnership programs. They get a whole lot of tax breaks, as it turns out, and refunds from SARS. But at the end of the period, then they're not necessarily concerned what happens to those people. Do they get jobs? Do they get rolled onto some additional training? Now, there are some bonus points that are available for that, but then what people start doing is playing around with how many learners do we start off with and how many do we absorb, and let's game the system so that we can get the most points possible. Now, that's all very well and good, and I completely understand that businesses have to run as businesses. But at the end of the day, my concern is that we need to see change in this country. If you look at the fees must fall movement, it's simply a matter of our youth are just not going to accept the lack of opportunities in this country going forward.
Yeah. On that point of fees must fall, how would you suggest that BEE plays a role in finding a solution for that, Nomsa?
So there is the skills development budget that exists. It's now being created. It's 6% of leviable payroll across the economy. If that could be used towards, some of that at least, could be used towards paying these fees that need to fall, and they're not going to fall to the ground, let's just be honest about that. If some of those fees could be paid through that initiative, instead of just creating these learnerships, which take people nowhere very slowly, that could be a solution. Another solution could be looking at how these ownership structures are being created and where some of that money could go towards proper skills development initiatives where we are actually paying school fees for these kids.
Speaking of ownership, one of the criticisms that has come very strongly on the new changes to the codes is that it focuses too much on individual ownership instead of broad-based structures like trusts and employee incentive schemes or that kind of thing. Is that necessarily a bad thing?
There are two ways to look at it. On the one hand, you've got the people who have been part of these corporate structures and corporate schemes, which some were not necessarily created as proper broad-based participation, where someone leaves the organization and they leave their shares behind, so they've got no capital participation, and you ask yourself, are these real participation or not? On the other hand, you get communities who've had schools built, who've had the education of their children being paid for by these corporates. So there is some of it works, some of it doesn't work, but it always comes down to the question of, if you've got broad participation, who do you really point to as your actual shareholder who's making decisions? Are you bringing in black people into the fold? Are they sitting in the boardrooms and making these decisions?
And the answer is they're not, right?
That's correct, but we must also bear in mind how investments work. If you're a minority shareholder in a business, you're not generally making the decisions. There's a management team on the ground, a set of directors, a board that is making those decisions. That's how investment works in South Africa, on the JSE, through asset unit trusts, those kinds of things. I believe that by focusing solely on these individuals, that we're actually stopping them from going out and creating their own businesses, being entrepreneurs, and creating jobs in the process.
How so?
Because people end up focusing only on doing BEE deals, as opposed, and it's almost as if we're saying to black people, you're only good enough to be a part shareholder of this business, as opposed to empowering them to go out and creating businesses where jobs will be created.
But what's the logic of having made that change on the government's part, Nomzamo? Because the previous criticism was that the way that BEE was rolled out, it made a few black people fabulously rich and didn't empower everybody else. And so they came up with the broad-based schemes. Now why revert back to the individual shareholding?
Because I think part of it is looking at how they can roll it into the Black Industrialists program, because there is a need to create those black people who will be major participants in the economy at the end of the day. It's not a change that's going to happen on its own. Something will need to trigger it, and part of it was actually rolling or restricting the participation by broad-based schemes. But I have to say that they did, the Minister of Trade and Industry did actually take back that statement, and if your ownership as a corporate is solely made up of a broad-based participation, it doesn't mean that your score will be limited only to the 3 points that are on the scorecard.
Okay, let's touch a bit on the industrialists that you brought up. What's the logic there?
It's to create mega conglomerates in South Africa in the manufacturing space. That's the brief that came from the DTI. So
Okay.
as far as the practicality of that is concerned, I'm not clear, because the document still hasn't been issued for public consumption. The bill is still not been signed by Parliament. So the idea really is about creating the manufacturing conglomerates that will create the jobs that we so desperately need in this country.
And you had many people very excited about, the introduction of these black industrialists. Is that a good idea in your view?
I think that we need to be careful. I believe that a lot of research needs to be done. I don't know what research has been done in terms of manufacturing, but how are we going to compete effectively with China? Over the last 20, 30 years, our manufacturing sector has gradually, if not quite fast, dwindled away. Whereas we're very strong in some areas of our economy. Look at your IT. We're starting to come up with great ideas and be noticed for our IT base in Cape Town. We have a very strong services environment or offering within the economy.
I have to take a short break, but I do want to ask you this after the break. Isn't that then the reason why the solution is being brought to the table? Because we haven't had the majority of the people participating in the manufacturing sector. To think about that as we take this short break. Welcome back. We are wrapping up our discussion on BEE, talking to our guests who are experts in the field and also taking your thoughts on Facebook and on Twitter. Lihlohonolo Dire says, the codes are good, but most big companies have enough money not to follow the codes. And Kutalo Stanop says, BEE will cripple small businesses since some of them rely on government for finance. And Pindat Lamini says, corruption by funding people who do not deserve government funding is what is getting us down in this country. And I'm sure she's talking about BEE deals going to people that she doesn't feel are deserving. Do send us your thoughts as well, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can in the time that we've got available now. So, ladies, before with the break, Alana, I asked if you could comment on, what was it I asked you to talk about?
Industrialists.
Yes, on industrialists.
And should we not be creating them? I'm not saying we shouldn't be creating them. I'm just saying there seems to be a huge focus on the manufacturing sector, and I'm questioning whether that's the only sector we should be focusing on.
But shouldn't we say we're starting somewhere? Where do we start? We did mining, and there was an outcry about the interventions that were happening in the mining space. Now it's manufacturing.
But let's start with something we're good at already. We're not doing so well in the manufacturing space, so it makes sense to me to actually focus on our strengths. If we're service-based, and services can really create a lot of jobs, so can IT. Let me give you an example. I don't know who these 100 industrialists are supposed to be, but one of the incubators that we work with, I heard this week, one of the young guys coming out of one of these incubators created a great novelty and innovation around tablets. And he's been trying to get funding in South Africa, and he's gone, as far as I understand, pretty much everywhere he can go, and he's not able to get funding. In fact, he now has an offer from Silicon Valley in the States to go there. And they've offered him a green card because, of course, they want the technology to belong to the Americans. So it is a travesty that we could have a situation like that. He wants to create a factory here in South Africa to make these tablets. It's a travesty that he can't get funding for it. It's even more concerning given the fact that he is actually black. How is it possible that a man like that can't find funding?
Maybe he's one of the 100. We'll have to wait and see.
Not yet, apparently.
But I just want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how the corporates are rolling out BEE in their spaces. Are we not doing a disservice to government by saying BEE in itself and the way it's being implemented is not correct, instead of turning our attention to the corporates and saying, hey, you guys are taking a good policy and implementing it in your companies incorrectly?
I thoroughly agree with that. But the question is, how do we get corporates to do this the right way? Beating them over the head with a stick isn't achieving it, because at best we're getting compliance, and at worst people are finding, clever people are making a lot of money to find ways around BEE and ways to avoid it so that corporates can pay even less and do even less.
Okay. Nomzamo, looking outside of BEE, we've had the Ministry of Small Business Development coming up with just over 3.5 billion rand to create these small and medium enterprises. But is that the right solution for our country? If we were to say, BEE has done its bit, now let's look at something else that can maybe augment that.
I think small business alone isn't going to cut it. Corporates still need to play a part, because the small businesses are looking for funding. They're not necessarily going to be creating the opportunities for further small businesses to be created. So corporate definitely still remains one of the major areas where great changes could be made in this country.
What, in your view, should be done to try and get corporates to do what they need to do in an environment where, at best, we're getting compliance?
I think clarity in the application of the code becomes one of the major areas that could be started with. My interpretation shouldn't necessarily be at 360 degrees different from Alana's interpretation.
And for you, Alana, what else should be done?
I know we touched on it a bit earlier, but incentives. As much as we might not like to have to create incentives for corporates that should be doing this, the reality is that if we don't think of a better way, it's not going to happen. We're just going to get left with compliance with a whole lot of money going down a black hole. So I think that we need a bit of a solution that merges the current scorecard, where you still need to get a scorecard, but merges that with some incentives that actually drive the real intentions within that scorecard, so that we can ultimately see jobs being created, people being developed, people able to fill those jobs, and the economy growing, as opposed to this redistribution of wealth that we're seeing at the moment.
Are we making enough of an effort as a country to try and change the complexion of the supply chains in these businesses, particularly the big corporates, Nomzamo?
I think we are. The entire purpose of changing the scorecard on procurement in particular, where the majority of your points will come from having black-owned businesses. So it's not just smaller black-owned businesses, you're looking at bigger black-owned businesses as well. So I think there is, that will be one of the areas of the greatest change. And in fact, it's one of the areas of the greatest challenge right now for most corporates.
And women?
Women are also a particular area that is being addressed, not as much as the black people in general, but women are being addressed, and so are black disabled people.
And in terms of, just finally, advice to corporates who are dealing with BEE and some of your clients as well, what would you say is the best way to partner with government on this?
Partnering with government. I think that public-private partnerships really can achieve a lot. If government can make funding available and corporates can look at actually creating the opportunities and not being blindfolded or tunnel visioned with BEE, and actually allowing their blinkers to see the real opportunities, they can actually then utilize government funding to create more opportunities for their own businesses, and at the same time empower everybody else.
Ladies, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming through to talk to us on this subject. I know that it is something that people get emotional about, because we all want to see the best for this country, but thank you for your time. And thanks to you for joining us here on Interface. To join us again next week at the same time. Good night.